In the dim confines of the 21st Bomber Command headquarters on Guam, the date was March 8, 1945, and target dossiers littered the planning table. Illuminated only by the cherry-red tip of his cigar, Major General Curtis LeMay scrutinized aerial imagery depicting Tokyo's industrial zones, noting how, as you will see, the Empire's vast military-industrial complex was fragmented into thousands of rudimentary wooden machine shops and residential homes masquerading as munitions plants. Following an incoming reconnaissance dispatch confirming optimal wind currents, negligible cloud cover, and highly congested residential industrial zones, the stage was set for an unprecedented assault on a metropolis constructed almost entirely of timber and paper. Setting aside his coffee, the commander grasped the operations receiver to authorize the imminent departure of 334 B-29 Superfortresses from runways spanning Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Unbeknownst to the air crews at the time, you are about to witness how this singular strategic pivot was destined to unleash the most catastrophic incendiary offensive ever recorded in human history. Through bitter experience in the Pacific theater, American strategists had come to realize what you may already suspect. Japan's production capabilities were completely unlike the colossal centralized hubs of Detroit or Pittsburgh, but were instead deliberately cloaked within civilian enclaves, meaning that severing these decentralized supply chains was the only way to cripple the enemy's war effort. Decades of meticulous evolution had shaped the Japanese industrial framework into a highly unorthodox apparatus, where more than 50% of Tokyo's military yield flowed from intimate cottage industries, utilizing fewer than 30 laborers. Whether it was aviation components forged in suburban dwellings, metallurgy conducted in backyard sheds, or delicate instruments pieced together inside transformed temples, the network was staggering. The Mitsubishi aircraft conglomerate, for instance, depended upon over 300 distinct vendors strewn across the capital's metropolitan sprawl. To comprehend the monumental effort required to dismantle this elusive web, you must examine the weapon employed. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, representing the absolute zenith of United States aerospace engineering, a leviathan displacing 20 tons unladen and driven by 4 Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines that each generated 2,200 horsepower. As Major General Curtis Emerson LeMay analyzed atmospheric charts of the Japanese archipelago from his briefing room, he managed an armada of 345 combat-ready B-29s distributed across the Mariana Islands. Manned by an 11-person crew, every individual bomber was capable of hauling 20,000 pounds of ordnance to destinations 1,500 miles distant, symbolizing the costliest military development of the Second World War at an investment of $3.7 billion. Yet, as you consider that daytime pinpoint strikes had successfully obliterated German infrastructure, hitting Japanese targets proved mathematically and operationally dissimilar. Releasing payloads from extreme elevations yielded accuracy rates below 5%, largely owing to newly discovered jet stream gales that roared past 250 miles per hour in the upper atmosphere. Embedded within the Army Air Force's Office of Statistical Control, Captain Robert McNamara, a Harvard-trained mind deeply rooted in operations research, scrutinized these dismal performance metrics to find a workable solution. He recognized that aerial warfare fundamentally boiled down to ruthless arithmetic, calculating the tonnage of explosives dropped per flight, tracking the exact percentages of eradicated objectives, and measuring the financial burden required to wipe out every square mile of enemy production capability. As you shift your perspective to the Japanese side of the conflict in the heart of Tokyo, planning official Ginjiro Fujiwara continuously evaluated industrial decentralization records, overseeing a defensive doctrine aggressively implemented by authorities to scatter vital assembly lines deep into municipal zones following the unexpected Doolittle raid of 1942. This deliberate fragmentation meant that aviation motor parts were being milled in the Asakusa district, electrical grids were wired in Fukugawa, and ball bearings were turned in the Sumida ward, with countless miniature facilities seamlessly woven into the civilian fabric to frustrate concentrated aerial assaults. As you can imagine, this strategy had triumphantly thwarted high-altitude American raids, with bombers cruising at 30,000 feet consistently failing to strike even the most sprawling industrial estates. Nevertheless, Fujiwara harbored a profound terror of uncontrollable blazes, acutely aware that the devastating Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 had exposed the severe susceptibility of Japanese architecture to massive conflagrations, a horrifying prospect that grew exponentially more likely with every daily overflight by hostile aircraft. If you review the operational data leading up to February of 1945, the United States Strategic Bombing Initiative had produced staggeringly inadequate outcomes, with the 21st Bomber Command executing 22 sorties since the previous November to virtually no effect. To illustrate this catastrophic failure, the Nakajima Aircraft Engine Facility at Musashino absorbed 7 distinct raids, yet sustained total structural damage of less than 4%. Consequently, immense political weight crushed down upon General Henry Hap Arnold, who had staked his legacy and the very concept of an autonomous air branch on the exorbitant Superfortress program. While lawmakers interrogated the billions squandered on inaccurate planes, the Navy championed carrier-based assaults, and the Army readied ground troops under the assumption that aviation alone could never compel a Japanese capitulation. Digging into the root of this crisis, intelligence specialist Lieutenant Colonel Robert Olds synthesized target data that laid bare the unique atmospheric hurdles of the region, revealing how perpetual cloud banks masked objectives and violent jet streams blew ordnance miles off course. Furthermore, enemy interceptors had mastered the art of ambushing the heavy bombers during their most exposed attack phases, driving casualty rates to an unsustainable 6% per deployment. When you examine the breathtakingly audacious tactical reversal initiated at 17:35 hours on March 9th, you will see the first B-29 depart Guam's North Field radically transformed. LeMay had ordered the extraction of all armor and turret weaponry, save for the tailguns, trading every ounce of saved weight for a devastating payload of firebombs, plunging the strike altitude down to a mere 5,000 to 9,000 feet, and trading daylight precision for nocturnal incendiary devastation. You must understand that the established doctrines of strategic aerial assault were entirely overturned during this operation. Meteorological predictions pointed to absolutely perfect environmental variables for the mission. Ground-level breezes blowing at 28 miles per hour were expected to drive the blaze through the designated neighborhoods, while the lack of moisture in the air would hasten the expansion of the conflagration, and cloudless heavens guaranteed flawless sightlines for the lead Pathfinder planes. When you look at the raw mathematics of the payload, the figures are truly apocalyptic. Every single Boeing B-29 Superfortress, B-29, aircraft was loaded with 40 bundles of A and 69 incendiary devices, with each of those bundles housing 38 separate munitions packed with a gelatinous napalm mixture. Upon detonation, the heat generated surpassed 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, sustaining combustion for roughly 6 minutes. With an individual payload of 6 tons per plane, multiplied across a fleet of 334 dispatched bombers, the final arithmetic resulted in 1,665 tons of fire-starting ordnance destined to saturate a zone spanning roughly 12 square miles. As you examine the Japanese capital's protective infrastructure, it becomes clear that their firefighting capabilities were tragically insufficient. An urban center housing 7 million residents relied on a mere 8,000 emergency responders, equipped with only 3 specialized vehicles that could extend ladders beyond a second floor. The vast majority of domestic neighborhoods lacked any pressurized aquatic networks, featuring instead confined alleyways destined to ensnare fleeing non-combatants alongside timber structures built mere inches apart. Furthermore, subterranean bunkers were practically absent, as the ruling authorities feared that building such refuges would severely undermine public spirit by implying the metropolis was genuinely vulnerable to airborne strikes. If you trace the timeline, the initial wave of Pathfinder planes breached the airspace above Tokyo precisely at 0008 hours on the 10th of March. Utilizing advanced radio detection and ranging instruments, the crews pinpointed their primary target within the Shitamachi ward, which stood as the most heavily crowded sector of the entire municipality. These vanguard aviators released their combustible payloads in synchronized, parallel formations, forging a blazing cross pattern that could be easily seen from 50 miles in the distance. Consequently, the trailing squadrons needed only to guide their ships toward this glowing intersection, releasing their own munitions to systematically push the Inferno's boundaries ever outward. If you observed the sky for 3 agonizing hours, endless formations of bombers materialized over the capital, with 279 B-29s successfully penetrating the strike zone. The ensuing blaze propagated precisely in accordance with the prior analytical models, as isolated pockets of flame rapidly consolidated into a massive, unified conflagration. This regional blaze quickly mutated into an uncontrollable firestorm, driving surface temperatures well beyond 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. This intensely heated atmosphere ascended so aggressively that it generated cyclonic gales along the streets, vacuuming breathable air out of hiding spots, while simultaneously funneling fresh gusts directly into the hungry fires. By 2 o'clock in the morning on March 10th, you would have seen 16 square miles of Tokyo entirely engulfed in flames. Official law enforcement dispatches painted a picture of unfathomable terror, describing waterways bubbling at the boiling point, paved avenues turning into molten sludge, and window panes melting into liquid streams. While iron streetlights warped under the extreme thermal stress, the emergency response network suffered total systemic failure as the communication cables incinerated. High above, Rear Defensive Specialist Sergeant James C.R. noted that his weaponry was completely redundant. The defending interceptor planes were physically incapable of flying through the boiling atmosphere, and surface-to-air artillery ceased firing entirely when the operators abandoned their posts to escape the encroaching blaze. For the attacking crews, you will find the most lethal threat proved to be the violent atmospheric instability generated by ascending heat pillars, which possessed enough kinetic energy to toss a 60-ton bomber around like a twig in a cyclone. Aviators documented that they could actually detect the scent of roasting human remains from an elevation of 5,000 feet. Ultimately, the statistical measures of destruction surpassed every single preliminary estimate. 267,171 structures were obliterated, leaving 1,805 individuals without shelter. While the government recorded 83,793 fatalities, the true number of the dead almost certainly climbed past 100,000. You must grasp the grim reality that more human beings perished within those 6 hours than in any other isolated combat event in our species' timeline, surpassing even the nuclear strikes that would occur 5 months later, effectively erasing 25% of the metropolis before dawn. The Empire's own manufacturing data painted the aftermath in brutal, undeniable mathematics. Within the capital's perimeter, the construction of aviation motors plummeted by 75% in a single evening, while the manufacturing of highly calibrated instruments was thoroughly eradicated throughout the stricken zones. Furthermore, a dozen primary distributors responsible for creating electrical parts were wiped from existence, and 40% of the country's entire capacity to produce spherical bearings was instantly destroyed. As you analyze the broader economic fallout, you can observe a domino effect that crippled comprehensive logistical networks, driven by the literal incineration of crucial parts manufacturers. If you reviewed the reconnaissance data from the following day, on the 11th of March, observation planes captured photographic evidence of the ruins where heavily congested industrial sectors had thrived just 48 hours prior. They documented nothing but endless expanses of gray debris, revealing 16 square miles of charred terrain, interrupted only rarely by the few cement edifices capable of withstanding the hellfire. Industrial smokestacks protruded from the wasteland like tombstones, marking the remains of vaporized plants. Meanwhile, the train depots had been contorted into bizarre, unnatural monuments of liquefied iron. However, you will find that the mental devastation inflicted upon the populace vastly overshadowed the material ruin. Employee truancy surged uncontrollably as those left alive abandoned their posts to hunt for vanished relatives, prompting plant supervisors to document a 60% plunge in productivity from their deeply scarred workforce. Strategic wartime timetables dissolved into irrelevance as comprehensive distribution webs simply vanished. Concurrently, the legendary belief in a sacred gale that shielded the island nation from external conquerors dissolved into nothingness. Decrypted communications exposed an escalating terror within the imperial leadership hierarchy. Naval administrative dossiers detailed a total collapse of logistical harmony. Ground force purchasing agents flagged disastrous interruptions in the arrival of essential parts, and the armament department's ledgers confirmed permanent deprivations of specialized manufacturing assets. As you track the military campaign further, the decentralized production model, which had previously safeguarded their industries from targeted aerial strikes, turned out to be lethally susceptible to widespread combustible bombardments. Commander LeMay mandated the subsequent assault, or the capital was still smoldering. Thus, on March 11th, 285 B-29s bombarded Nagoya, the undisputed hub of Japanese aviation manufacturing. The Mitsubishi Aeronautical Corporation had scattered its production processes across 300 distinct secondary workshops woven throughout the municipality, but the resulting firestorm eradicated them all at the exact same time. 2 square miles of the industrial heartland simply evaporated into the atmosphere, causing airplane construction to plummet by 40% in a mere 24 hours. The destruction arrived at Osaka's doorstep on the 13th of March, when 274 superfortresses discharged 1,733 tons of flaming ordnance over the nation's second most populous metropolis. The primary armory, responsible for churning out 1/5 of the Empire's munitions, was entirely expunged from the map. 8 square miles of mercantile zones were reduced to cinders, leveling 134,744 structures, while the harbor terminals, managing 30% of the country's incoming trade, were scorched straight down to the sea. Finally, you witnessed the eradication of Kobe on March 16th, as 331 B-29s turned the 6th largest municipality into a raging furnace. The Kawasaki Maritime Construction Yards, which assembled 1/3 of the civilian maritime fleet, blazed continuously for 3 days. Concurrently, the Mitsubishi and Kawanishi aviation facilities were stripped of 60% of their operational strength, finalizing the erasure of 7 square miles of metropolitan territory. The vital transit corridors linking the western regions of Japan to Tokyo were entirely severed. On March 19th, a devastating return strike on Nagoya brought the 5-day offensive to its conclusion. A massive fleet of 290 superfortresses finalized the devastation initiated during their initial assault. The Ichi Aircraft Company, responsible for manufacturing naval attack planes, simultaneously suffered the destruction of all its decentralized facilities. Neighborhoods sheltering crucial artisans were completely vaporized, while vocational academies dedicated to preparing aviation technicians burned to the ground. Consequently, another 3 square miles of productive capacity were permanently excised from the Japanese martial infrastructure. The ensuing data presented an undeniable picture of absolute ruin. Over a mere 10-day period, B-29 bombers unleashed 9,373 tons of incendiary munitions upon the nation's urban centers. 42 square miles of metropolitan terrain were entirely erased, rendering 1.5 million citizens utterly destitute. Industrial productivity plummeted catastrophically across the board. The creation of airplanes dropped by 68%, ordnance construction decreased by 50%, and mechanical tooling operations crashed by 72%. This domino effect of collapsing integrated systems triggered total financial stagnation. Yet LeMay was merely getting started. Operation Starvation commenced concurrently alongside the relentless firebombing raids. Heavy bombers belonging to the 313th Bombardment Wing initiated the deployment of aquatic explosives throughout Japanese territorial seas. These 25 mines were equipped with sophisticated acoustic and magnetic triggers, rendering traditional clearance efforts practically futile. Ultimately, 12,000 of these devices would successfully seal off every significant harbor across the country. The volume of incoming cargo, which had previously plummeted by 90% due to relentless submarine attacks, essentially reached zero. A catastrophic scarcity of unrefined resources paralyzed the nation within a matter of days. For instance, the production of steel relied heavily upon iron ore sourced from Manchuria and the Korean peninsula. The absence of maritime transport meant no raw ore, which subsequently halted steel production, ultimately leaving the military without essential armaments. Similarly, the fabrication of aluminum was contingent upon bauxite imports from southern territories, a supply chain that was now entirely severed. Furthermore, the vital pipelines delivering crude oil from the Dutch East Indies for aviation fuel were irrevocably shattered, and the external food supplies necessary to sustain the labor force completely vanished, forcing the domestic economy to cannibalize itself. Throughout the spring months, the relentless aerial assault only intensified. On April 13th, 327 B-29s descended upon Tokyo once more, thoroughly annihilating the arsenal sector. 2 days later, on April 15th, 109 superfortresses effectively dismantled the engine manufacturing complexes situated in Kawasaki. Subsequently, on May 14th, 472 heavy bombers struck Nagoya during what became the most massive daytime incendiary offensive of the entire conflict. The methodical obliteration of the enemy's industrial prowess advanced with terrifying clockwork precision. By the 25th of May, the threat of total destruction extended even to secondary municipalities. In a single evening, Yokohama saw 6.9 square miles, amounting to 42% of its total metropolitan space, reduced to ashes. Simultaneously, Tokyo endured another catastrophic bombardment that scorched an additional 16.8 square miles of the city. The once thriving capital, formerly home to 7 million residents, was now 50% ruined debris. Consequently, the industrial output originating from the combined Tokyo-Yokohama manufacturing zone, which historically supplied 35% of the empire's military hardware, virtually evaporated. The ensuing human catastrophe escalated to an unimaginable scale. Every single bombing mission inflicted casualties numbering in the tens of thousands. Facilities intended for medical care were completely overrun by severe burn victims, all while suffering from a critical lack of essential treatments. As the infrastructure for distributing sustenance completely disintegrated, severe undernourishment swept through the population. Rampant illness quickly followed in the wake of failing public hygiene networks. Crucially, thousands of the highly trained artisans required for complex manufacturing operations, individuals who had dedicated years to mastering their crafts, perished in the flames, representing an irreplaceable loss of specialized expertise. By the time August of 1945 arrived, this methodical extermination had morphed into a standard operational procedure. LeMay's target list had broadened significantly, pinpointing any municipality harboring a population greater than 30,000 inhabitants. A staggering total of 66 Japanese urban centers had been subjected to intense firebombing. 180 square miles of metropolitan districts were thoroughly erased from the map, leaving 21 million citizens forcibly displaced from their residences. The robust industrial foundation that had once maintained an army of 5 million soldiers and the third largest naval fleet on the planet was systematically pounded into smoldering wreckage. Production metrics highlighted a scenario of absolute economic collapse. The assembly of aircraft, which had reached a zenith of 2,572 units during September of 1944, plummeted drastically to just 1,131 by July of 1945. The creation of engine components dropped by 75%, while the manufacturing of propellers decreased by 80%. Additionally, the production of electronic parts was essentially wiped out entirely. These destructive cycles compounded exponentially. A lack of spherical bearings halted engine assembly, the absence of engines prevented aircraft construction, and without airplanes, the nation remained utterly defenseless against the B-29s that struck every night with ruthless efficiency. The ultimate numerical records of the campaign defied comprehension. The aggregate weight of dropped explosives reached 147,000 tons, delivered across 15,000 individual flight missions. The United States sacrificed 414 B-29 aircraft, suffering approximately 2,600 aviator casualties. In stark contrast to these figures, the strategic bombardment inflicted between 400,000 and 600,000 fatalities upon the Japanese populace, while simultaneously leaving millions more wounded or homeless. Astoundingly, the civilian death toll suffered by Tokyo during a single evening surpassed the total civilian fatalities experienced by Britain throughout the entirety of the global conflict. During post-war interrogations conducted by American researchers, the testimony provided by Prince Fumimaru Kono was incredibly explicit. He asserted that the primary catalyst for their decision to pursue peace was the sustained aerial bombardment executed by the B-29s. Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai echoed this sentiment, identifying the Superfortress as the single most critical element in compelling the empire's capitulation. Furthermore, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey determined that, even without the use of atomic bombs or a ground invasion, the nation would have unconditionally surrendered by November of 1945, driven entirely by conventional aerial assaults and naval blockades. The technological advancements demonstrated during these operations fundamentally transformed the nature of armed conflict. Strategic bombing firmly established itself as an independent capability capable of securing ultimate victory. By successfully dismantling whole economic systems from the sky, military planners completely negated the necessity for terrestrial invasions. General Arnold's long-held vision of an autonomous aviation branch finally materialized in 1947, heavily predicated upon the triumphs achieved by the B-29 over Japan. Every subsequent aerial warfare campaign would heavily draw upon the tactical insights gained during 1945, as American technological dominance had proven absolutely definitive. Between 1943 and 1946, Boeing manufactured 3,970 B-29s, with each unit demanding $639,188, a sum roughly equal to $11 million in contemporary currency. The total program investment of $3.7 billion significantly dwarfed the $2 billion budget of the Manhattan Project. Yet the ultimate payoff was irrefutable. The fundamental pillars of an entire empire were systematically eradicated, and the relatively minor cost of 414 bombers and 2,600 airmen. Although the cold mathematics of strategic warfare were conclusively resolved, the ethical ramifications sparked decades of intense philosophical debate. In 1945, international law did not explicitly forbid the widespread area bombardment of metropolitan zones. The HEG conventions established rules regarding legitimate military targets, but they failed to address the status of civilian laborers. Because Japanese officials had intentionally dispersed their military assembly lines directly into residential neighborhoods, distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants became a practical impossibility. Military strategists in the United States maintained that destroying the enemy's capacity to wage war provided adequate justification for the resulting loss of non-combatant lives, even as detractors fiercely denounced the intentional bombardment of urban centers as severe violations of international law. General LeMay maintained a stance of resolute defiance until his death, viewing the conflict through a lens of stark pragmatism. He frequently justified his devastating campaigns by reminding his critics of the initial attack on American soil, posing a chillingly pragmatic question to you: whether you would prefer to see Japanese citizens perish or American soldiers fall in battle. The impending ground assault on the Japanese home islands, designated as Operation Downfall, carried a horrifying forecast of 1 million American casualties. The initial phase of this massive undertaking, an invasion of Kyushu known as Olympic, slated for November 1945, was predicted to claim 250,000 troops within merely the first 30 days of combat. Subsequent plans for Coronet, a massive strike against Honshu scheduled for March 1946, carried expectations of a casualty rate that would eclipse even those staggering preliminary figures. Classified directives recovered following the nation's capitulation exposed Operation Katugo, an extreme defensive strategy designed to draft every single citizen into a desperate final stand. This sweeping mandate had effectively conscripted 28 million ordinary civilians into makeshift military divisions, arming women and children with sharpened bamboo poles, and subjecting entire municipalities to rigorous instruction in suicidal assault tactics. Planners behind the National Resistance Program coldly calculated that defending their sovereign territory would require the sacrifice of 20 million Japanese lives. When measured against these apocalyptic estimates, the staggering death toll inflicted by the aerial bombardments seemed like a mere fraction of the blood that would have been spilled during a full-scale land invasion. The resulting systemic collapse was absolute and irreversible, completely dismantling the mighty Zaibatsu conglomerates that had previously dominated the nation's vertically integrated economy. Furthermore, the decentralized manufacturing networks that had historically driven their operational efficiency were thoroughly wiped off the map. Rebuilding the shattered nation in the aftermath of such total ruin necessitated a radical reinvention of corporate and organizational hierarchies. It was precisely out of the smoldering ruins of 1945 that innovative paradigms, such as the Toyota system and just-in-time manufacturing, were eventually forged. These groundbreaking operational strategies would lay dormant for years before ultimately rising from the devastation to completely transform the landscape of global commerce decades later. The crucible of the Pacific Theater catalyzed a breathtaking acceleration in technological advancements that far exceeded all prior predictions. Specialized radar navigation systems allowed Pathfinder crews to pinpoint targets in pitch blackness, while breakthroughs in incendiary chemistry birthed uncontrollable conflagrations that consumed entire metropolises. From mathematical operations research that perfected bombing formations to sophisticated electronic command networks that coordinated massive fleets across thousands of miles, virtually every foundational element of contemporary aerial combat was forged in the skies over Japan. Beyond the physical destruction, the campaign exacted an equally devastating psychological toll on the besieged populace. The deeply entrenched cultural belief in Yamato Damashi, the supposedly unconquerable Japanese spirit, was ultimately crushed beneath the relentless weight of superior mechanized warfare. The legendary divine winds that had once scattered Mongol armadas proved utterly powerless to halt the B-29s, and an ancient warrior tradition, valuing death before dishonor, lost all meaning while facing merciless incendiary bombs that reduced the conquerors of East Asia to ash in a mere 5 months. The inescapable reality of their impending subjugation could no longer be ignored by the Imperial High Command. Although Admiral Su Toyota, Chief of Naval General Staff, testified that he believed Russian participation in the war against Japan did more to hasten the surrender than the atomic blasts, his own internal documents told a vastly different story. Confidential naval intelligence briefings, drafted in July 1945, explicitly warned that the relentless aerial bombardment was swiftly destroying their domestic infrastructure, definitively concluding that carrying on with the struggle had become an absolute impossibility. The long-term impact of the B-29 rippled extensively outward, shaping global conflicts long after the conclusion of World War II. The foundational philosophies guiding Strategic Air Command's nuclear deterrence heavily relied upon the brutal lessons learned by the 21st Bomber Command. This fundamental belief that undisputed supremacy in the skies could unilaterally dictate the victors of modern conflicts heavily influenced Cold War strategy and inspired subsequent aerial campaigns in Vietnam, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan, with a complex legacy of strategic bombardment continuing to govern military doctrines 8 decades later. The arduous journey toward national rehabilitation spanned 2 full decades, heavily spurred by the massive industrial reconstruction demand triggered by the Korean War between 1950 and 1953. The very same American occupation authorities who had orchestrated the systematic elimination of the archipelago suddenly found themselves tasked with supervising its comprehensive rebuilding. Consequently, the urban districts that had been incinerated in 1945 miraculously transformed into thriving hubs of an economic miracle by 1965, birthing powerhouse electronics giants and allowing Toyota City to rise directly from Nagoya's ashes, forging the world's second-largest economy from history's most complete annihilation. Recognizing his ruthlessly effective tactics, military leadership elevated Curtis LeMay to the rank of lieutenant general a mere 2 weeks following the formal Japanese surrender. His subsequent command of Strategic Air Command from 1948 until 1957 profoundly shaped American nuclear strategy throughout the Cold War. The precise, merciless, calculated logic that had previously determined incendiary loads over Tokyo was eventually repurposed to select the nuclear targeting of Soviet cities, directly tracing the terrifying doctrine of mutual assured destruction back to the precedent set by Operation Meeting House. Robert McNamara, who initially analyzed bombing effectiveness for LeMay, would eventually serve as Secretary of Defense during Vietnam. While offering his retrospection in the 2003 documentary The Fog of War, he candidly addressed the ethical nightmare of the firebombing campaign, recalling LeMay's own admission that a defeat would have certainly led to their prosecution as war criminals. McNamara openly agreed with this grim assessment, acknowledging that he and his superiors were essentially behaving as perpetrators of war crimes, thereby ensuring that the profound moral questions regarding proportional force and civilian casualties remain a central point of contention in modern warfare debates. The culminating combat sortie of the B-29 fleet took to the skies on August 14, 1945, mere hours before Emperor Hirohito announced his nation's surrender. A massive armada, consisting of 143 superfortresses, unleashed their payloads upon the Nippon Oil Company refinery, located at Tsuchiyaki. It was only as these massive aircraft were navigating their route back to base that radio operators finally received the definitive ceasefire order, officially completing a relentless strategic bombing campaign that had successfully reduced Japanese capabilities by 70%. The ultimate equation of the conflict painted a grim but undeniable picture of total victory, marked by the release of 147,000 tons of explosives that completely obliterated 66 major cities and eliminated an entire economy. Lying ruined at the muddy bottom of Tokyo Bay was the battleship Nagato, sunk by American carrier aircraft. Once considered the supreme pride of the Imperial Navy, her colossal guns, capable of hurling 3,200-pound shells across 25 miles, had ultimately proven entirely worthless against bombers flying from islands 1,500 miles away. The dominant age of the battleship had definitively concluded, violently usurped by the terrifying new era of strategic air power. Curtis LeMay and his B-29s had successfully demonstrated, with a chilling, calculated certainty above the burning cities of Japan, that an entire sovereign economy could be systematically eliminated from the air. The crude bamboo spears that had been so desperately distributed to Japanese civilians for homeland defense were ultimately never used, and they rest today in museums as silent relics of a war that ended not through invasion, but through the absolute, methodical aerial elimination of capabilities. The devastating impact of the B-29 bomber extended far beyond merely reducing Japanese infrastructure to ruins. This formidable aircraft served as a stark revelation that contemporary warfare would henceforth be dominated by whichever power possessed the ultimate combination of advanced technology, overwhelming resources, and the tactical brilliance to utilize them with maximum efficiency. Ultimately, from the smoldering remains of 66 Japanese urban centers, the structural underpinnings of our current global hierarchy were definitively forged.